Welcome and Eric, and thank him for being here. He's got 20 years experience in this field. He's done some research, but also done a lot of actual work with people and groups and early intervention, especially. He's participated in coming out with 3 books on acceptance and commitment therapy. The most recent one is it's called Act for Psychosis Recovery, a practical manual for group-based interventions using acceptance and commitment therapy. So maybe without further ado, I can just turn it over to Eric.
Thank you very much, Ron. And it's a real pleasure to be here talking with you folk. And for one of my favorite organisations, ISPS. I'm more familiar with ISPS in the UK, Europe, and Australia due to where I lived and worked. Um, but it's exciting to be able to share this work with ISPS US and the opportunity to talk about acceptance and commitment therapy and the group work that we developed both in the United Kingdom and I'm also working on with folk over here in Australia. Um, I think to provide also a bit of an introduction, um, yes, I've worked for a long time in services for people with psychosis and with carers. Um, I got into this work as a psychologist, well, before I was a psychologist, because I had family members with lived experience and I was curious and wanted to be helpful and useful when people are distressed. Just also curious about um, unusual experiences that we all can have as humans. Um, so that background of supporting family members and my own unusual experiences sort of probably pointed me in this direction of being interested in how you could help people using psychological approaches who are experiencing psychosis. Um, a large a large part of my career has also been as a cognitive behavioral therapist and a family intervention therapist. And so some of the flavor of what I'll present today will be on that background that all of us who uh, worked on active psychosis recovery come from a sort of cognitive behavioral background. And hopefully I'll be able to give you a flavor of that broader work and how that has influenced what we've put together. Um, so, if I acknowledge other people I've worked with in doing our research, um, the rest of my colleagues there, Joe and Louise, Lucy, Suzanne, Emma, and Mizana, are all based in the United Kingdom. Um, and the group work that I'll present has that flavour. We developed these ACT groups. So acceptance commitment therapy, we tend to shorten it to ACT. Um, we developed these groups in a city setting with a diverse population. Um, and hopefully you'll also get that flavour today of how this approach can be a broad, welcoming approach that supports personal recovery. So feel free in the chat to ask any questions as we go along. I'm really interested in folks' experience already with approaches like mindfulness, uh, using personal values to empower recovery, um, and any folk who are already familiar with acceptance and commitment therapy. It'd be lovely to sort of hear any questions, etc., about that. So yeah, this is our research team. But our work also engaged a much broader set of people. So we started 10 years ago developing these groups in an early intervention for psychosis service in Brixton in London. It started with Joe Oliver and myself, really trying to develop groups that would be fun and interesting and supportive for young people recovering from psychosis, and something that wouldn't necessarily look like school. A lot of the young people we saw had issues with literacy, um, were black and minority ethnic folk, didn't necessarily share the same sort of mainstream values as others in British society, and I wouldn't necessarily come to individual therapy when it was offered. Um, and so we were trying to think of ways to offer psychological approaches that would be a sort of a light touch, that wouldn't necessarily involve a heavy commitment from people, but would start to introduce them to ideas about personal recovery if they hadn't encountered that already, and ways of coping with their experiences. In an early intervention psychosis service, typically, many of the people you see do have, a reasonable recovery from a first episode of psychosis, but they tend to need, a period of ongoing support because a lot of people experience depression and anxiety, and their education or training or employment is disrupted. And so getting back on your feet, making sense of what has happened to you, um, maybe having your relationships work better, etc. That there's a need to really try and engage people where they're at and try and offer approaches that seem relevant and support coping and personal recovery. And so acceptance commitment therapy in our service in South London was one of the things we developed to be in the mix there, of ways to engage people to support their recovery. So there's both our research team, and we'll talk a little bit today about the couple of studies that we've done to evaluate ACT groups. But the largest set of people are our group facilitators. So this is some of the group facilitators we had in particularly our second study about ACT groups. So these folk all led groups with us in the broad South London area. And then as well as those folk in this picture, the broader set of mental health professionals who were also involved, and other peer supporters. And so one of the developments that we made, particularly in our second study, was about having peer co-facilitators for our groups. So, developing a group work program and trying to evaluate it and see whether it actually is helpful to people involves a large effort. And we were very fortunate that people seemed excited by what acceptance commitment therapy had to offer. And it's a sort of model that is not a model of treatment, it's a model of human flourishing. And so it's also a model for us, the helper. And that, I think, is one of the things that can get people enthusiastic about ACT, is that it emphasizes common humanity. It is about common processes that can, get us sort of entangled and stuck and distressed. And so, we were fortunate that over the 10 years, we had plenty of people helping us and being interested in trying to both give these groups, engage people in these groups, and working on evaluating the groups. So, for those of you who are less familiar with acceptance and commitment therapy, um, it's an approach that's been around in one form or another for at least 30 years. But it came onto the, I guess, the cognitive behavioral scene after the publication of the first ACT manual, which is a big, broad general manual, in 1999. And it's a contextual cognitive behavioral therapy. It's basically a more behaviorally focused therapy, um, and so it's linked to a basic science account of language and cognition called relational frame theory, which basically says that or suggests that our ability to appraise things, think about things, is a learned ability, and that one of the things that many of us learn to do is to relate things in an arbitrary way. And so this ability allows us to plan ahead, delay gratification, problem solve, etc. It's very advantageous. Uh, but it also has a dark side to it. Those same abilities that allow us to plan ahead can lead us to worry, can lead us to remember and experience in the here and now um, traumas and pains and hurts from a long time ago. It can lead us to objectify ourselves. And so, this is all very relevant to a psychological therapy. The acceptance commitment therapy model is a process-driven model. So um, the core processes, and I'll show you the model in just a bit, are about mindfulness and acceptance, openness to experience, and using personal values to empower choices and actions that you take. And so the when you're engaging someone in doing acceptance commitment therapy, you're very much focusing on how to promote and strengthen skills that perhaps they already have, but they're underusing. Skills of being open to experience and noticing experience, and skills of connecting with what really matters to you. And so this approach is also sort of a big, broad transdiagnostic approach. If you open up any ACT textbook, and basically the same model is there. It's the same model across a range of problems and disorders, etc. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we do the same thing with everyone. Of course, when we're trying to help folk, we are trying to develop an approach that's tailor-made for the person and identify perhaps where things are going wrong, the processes that may not be occurring as much or occurring in the wrong ways, and helping people in that sort of individualized way with this model. This is one of the challenges with group work, is that sometimes you can't do something so individualized, but we still emphasize these sort of broader processes of mindfulness and values-based action. And so the original ACT book in 1999 had this big, broad treatment model. And I was interested, I'd already been working for 5 years as a psychologist by that time. And it had seemed to me that the emphasis on acceptance of experience was very close to what was emphasized in cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis approaches. And the values piece in ACT seemed to me very, easily linked with a personal recovery approach. And so I was, curious about how we could develop this ACT approach to be useful for people with psychosis. And then some of the early work that was published about ACT for people with psychosis sort of emboldened that hope for me and other people. The key message in ACT is that negative thoughts and emotions and sensations are not inherently toxic to human health or our behavior or our well-being. That perhaps it is possible to have self-critical thoughts, to have feelings that yes you don't want, to have fears and anxieties, and function. Um, what might make these thoughts and emotions, sensations, etc., challenging for us are two psychological contexts. Um, so, experiential avoidance and cognitive fusion. And so, the ACT therapist is interested in helping people to, strengthen their skills in these contexts. So, experiential avoidance. There's a lot of research about experiential avoidance and how it can be costly to us as humans across a wide range of problems. Um, and so, experiential avoidance are attempts to change, avoid, or remove undesirable thoughts, emotions, or physical sensations at personal cost. So, an example here would be attempting to suppress distressing thoughts and feelings from awareness. Or we extend further, attempting to suppress a voice you're hearing, or visions that you're having, or worries you're having about perhaps other people spying on you, etc. And we know that broadly, suppression as a regular coping strategy has a lot of costs. So when people engage in suppression of their emotions and thoughts, this can actually tend to intensify those experiences, cause rebound effects. In other words, these experiences might actually increase with some frequency, etc. And we know from the studies of folk with psychosis that people distressed with psychosis can have a tendency to be trying to suppress the experiences that they're having. And this suppression is not necessarily a pathological aspect of human experience. This is what humans do with their experiences. Is sometimes we seek to try and squash down and really control unwanted experiences. That this is sort of natural for humans to do, but it can come at a lot of cost. The other area is about behavioral avoidance, avoiding situations that might trigger these experiences or are associated with these experiences. And again, we know from the broader cognitive behavioral literature and what we understand about, or what we've understood about distressing psychosis in the last 25, 30 years, is that avoidance can be a large feature of how people get stuck and entangled and trapped in worrying about future episodes of psychosis, worrying about themselves and self-stigmatization, and being concerned about the voices they hear, etc. And so, we're interested as ACT therapists in trying to understand how people might be trying to control or avoid their experiences when this is not useful to them, or when this is coming at quite a cost. The other context that we're interested in is something called cognitive fusion. And this fusion piece is basically a pouring together of the person and their thoughts and emotions, again at personal cost. So this is examples here are responding to thoughts and stories about yourself at the level of literal meaning. So being unable to necessarily see your thoughts or self-narratives as thoughts, seeing the process of it. And this is a naturally occurring phenomenon. It's hidden in language and our thought processes. A lot of the time, we are not necessarily noticing the process of our thinking, we're just thinking. And particularly when we get distressed or caught up with experiences, that caught up piece This is what we mean by cognitive fusion. Um, and when habitually we're unaware of the ongoing process of thinking and feeling, well, then this can uh, lead to us acting in sort of pretty rigid and unhelpful ways, particularly in the face of things that we're perceiving as threats, um, or concerns. So the ACT therapist is interested in is sitting alongside the client and helping them to notice this process of cognitive fusion. This is called by other names in other psychological therapies, psychosis. So this would be decentering or metacognitive awareness, if you've been familiar with that, or some sort of distancing. And at least one way that we help people to defuse in ACT, um, sort of is stepping back and taking an observer perspective toward their experiences, not in a detached way, so not in a suppressed or dissociated way, but just a slight move of observing experience. And that we find that doing that enables people to perhaps be less reactive to experience, but also have a little bit more wriggle room about what they decide to do with those experiences. So at least some of my work, some of the research I did was in helping voice hearers and distressed voice hearers who this move of cognitive diffusion or developing an observer perspective um, may help, some of the, at least it helps some of the voice hearers I worked with to be able to maybe start to have a different relationship to that experience of the voice or voices they heard. And you can strengthen this ability of observing and this diffusion through practices like mindfulness and noticing. And a little bit later on in this talk, I'll give you a sense of how we do that in our groups. So this is the ACT model of psychopathology, although you'll see in a sec that actually we focus more on strengths and flourishing. But you can see on the left-hand side, there are processes of experiential avoidance and cognitive fusion. Down at the bottom, you can see sometimes an attachment to a conceptualized self. And so stories about yourself that seem true, that can perhaps limit the choices and actions that you feel willing to take or you're able to take. So an example here would be for many folk with psychosis, they can have histories of childhood trauma and self stories about being oppressed, being a victim, maybe being fundamentally bad in some way, etc. And sometimes the work you're doing therapeutically is you may be encouraging people to activate themselves and do things that matter, and they run into their history and their stories about themselves that sort of might limit taking action. And so sometimes our work is sort of extending this perspective taking or observing into also those stories too. We're also sort of encouraging people to practice a little more being in the here and now. And connecting also with their values and perhaps starting to identify what their personal values are and construct personal values so that they maybe more often take actions and make choices based on those, and we see what happens with that. So the other part of ACT is very much an experiential, let's discover what life might be like with trying out a few of these skills. Let's discover what life might be like if, by acting on your values or getting more present. And we really do present this in a humble way to folk. we're not saying that this is a panacea or this is the answer. We're saying, well, um, you know, let's discover together whether there's any possibility that these skills that we're working on might help you to do more of what matters to you, or to develop a different relationship to voices, or to reconnect with people, etc. So the flip side of that sort of where things can go wrong is a model called the hexaflex, and this is just one way of describing ACT. You'll see in a sec we have some other ways of describing what you do in ACT. But in essence, it's all about a set of behaviors and skills that we're strengthening. So we're encouraging people to, from the left-hand side of this model, to open up to experience, um, but in a way where you're observing and watching what's happening, but not necessarily caught up with it. And you're doing that here and now, maybe from this observer perspective, and knowing what matters to you. And you can imagine for some of the folk that we're helping, that actually knowing what matters, that what I think and feel matters, setting a course for my life, all of these things that are part of a personal recovery approach is sort of in this model. Let's explore together, what would be a good life for you? Let's explore together, what actions and choices would you really like to be able to make? Um, you know, and let's help you be able to make these actions and choices, perhaps even in the face of quite, disturbing or distressing or entangling, you know, experiences. And so the ACT model, in a way, is a way of engaging people to do what's down in that sort of bottom right corner, to do what works, to engage in committed action, to be out there in the world, um, yeah, taking action in ways that matter to you, and using these psychological skills to empower you to do that. And so it's very much a sort of a model where these skills also matter to the therapist and helper too. We're in the same boat as humans. We all can get caught up with our experiences and not want to have, certain thoughts and memories and other things. We can also sort of, at times be disconnected from what matters to us, and get caught up in loops of avoidance and that sort of thing. And so the model also applies to the helper as well. And I think that flavor in our groups is very important, the common humanity piece. So you can simplify the ACT model. It doesn't necessarily have to be this sort of hexaflex. You can talk about 3 sets of skills, about being open, about being aware, and about being active. And in a way, I would say you're doing ACT if in your interactions with people, you're trying to foster these 3 things: being open to experience, being aware here and now, connected with your body in the environment you're in, with your history, and being active, connecting with what matters to you, and doing those things and discovering what it's like to live that way. And so that's what our ACT groups really are about promoting, are these sort of 3 skills of being open, aware, and active. Those 3 skills build something that's called psychological flexibility, and this is the ability to contact the present moment fully as a conscious human being and persist or change behavior in the service of chosen values. So let's discover from experience what it's like to do what matters to you. Let's discover from experience what it's like to respond flexibly to experiences that maybe before you felt like you had to try and push away or were very entangling and got you caught up in them. Let's discover what that's like and whether this empowers your life anymore. So very much is an approach that's interested in um, the client's experience of doing this. You know, again, not presented as the answer, more presented as maybe a helpful set of ideas for folks. I think it's great to be able to talk about this with ISPS US because I think people will be familiar with this. But this is a quote from Stephen Hayes, one of the originators of ACT. He wrote this in the foreword of a first book. You know, he said that those experiencing psychotic disorders are amongst the most stigmatized people on the planet. They're frequently objectified and dehumanized by society. And their unusual experiences and actions are often objects of ridicule and fear. You know, in the early intervention for psychosis service, you would frequently discover that the young people you were working with already had pretty stigmatizing ideas about unusual experiences, about hearing voices say or having ideas that other people didn't hold. And many people were fearful of other people discovering they had those experiences. They were fearful for the future. And, many folk would feel trapped by having a diagnosis of a psychotic disorder, of being involved with mental health services, etc. And, as a helper, I would say that, I'm not free of the cultural conditioning that's happened to me either. I think, I absorb all of the sort of media representations, of what psychosis and madness is portrayed to be. And so this stigma, which again is something that most of us, have as part of our repertoire, even if we try not to act on it, it's there. And so engaging people about that this is learned and that we can learn beyond this too, and being aware of how this sort of stigmatization process can occur for you both as a helper and say a citizen is important. And the other thing I think that is important about this quote is just thinking about the degree of alienation people can experience who've had psychosis, of disconnection from others, for fear of stigma, because of the experiences they've had. And so for me as a clinician, it's always been about, well, how do I reach people who perhaps do feel that alienation? And of course, how can I be useful to them and really foster a connection that is a respectful human to human connection. And I think that the ACT model is one of those ways that very deliberately has that as part of the process. So we were very fortunate, myself and Louise and Joe, to edit the first book about acceptance commitment therapy and mindfulness for psychosis. And that book was published in 2013. Was really bringing together. We were very fortunate to get a lot of the people who were developing this work to write chapters in that book. And we thought about, well, what's the common piece here in doing acceptance commitment therapy with folk with psychosis, and really we think that ACT-P, as we call it, aims to encourage a sort of more flexible, a more accepting and mindful way of responding to the symptoms of psychosis and associated emotions and thoughts, and that includes that sort of stigma piece, in order to increase values-based behaviour. So, we're not interested in mindfulness necessarily for its own sake. While mindfulness can have a number of benefits for people, um, when we're doing ACT, we're interested in promoting mindfulness in order to help people do things that matter to them. So it's a strategic sort of use of mindfulness. We think that mindfulness and acceptance is useful because the primary experiences that people have are, are not necessarily easily changed. So if you're taking um, prescribed medication, for example, and you're still hearing distressing voices, um, and uh, you're not sure what you can do. Well, a psychological approach can be very helpful here, where we uh, we don't know how to say stop voices if that's what you want, but we might be able to engage with you in using some skills to change your relationship with voices. But really, for the purpose of strengthening your ability to do what matters to you. And so it's all the time thinking of active acceptance and mindfulness as empowering people to live the sort of lives that they want to live. That's baked in to the approach. There've been a few studies about acceptance commitment therapy. Um, yeah, Vera, I'll give you some examples of values-based behaviour in a sec, if that's okay. Um, cool. So I guess this area about the studies, there have been 6 randomized controlled trials evaluating the efficacy of ACT. And some of these early trials are very exciting in terms of the effects that people reported. So Barkin, Hayes, and Gaudiano and Herbert, 2 studies done in the US, suggested that actually very brief ACT was associated with um, halving the rehospitalization rates for people who had been recently hospitalized with an episode of psychosis, and strengthening that sort of people's recovery processes, and reducing their distress associated with psychosis. Um, and those 2 studies, Buckenhays and Gaudiano and Herbert, certainly inspired us to think about, well, how in a community-based way might we be able to use ACT instead of in a hospital setting? Although then we also did work also in inpatient and acute settings, group work and individual work. There have also been several studies done here in Melbourne, um, uh, both with people experiencing distressing psychosis in general, and then folk um, with auditory hallucinations, distressing auditory hallucinations. And so they're the Shoya et al. Studies. And then a randomized controlled trial in Sweden in an acute setting, again, doing ACT in an inpatient environment, engaging people in a brief ACT protocol to support their recovery post-hospitalization. Vera, your question about values-based behavior is great. So values-based behavior, so these could be any actions and choices that are based on a personal direction that matters to you. So they're qualities of action that people may take. So an example of a value might be that I want to act like a loving person in my life. And that you can think of as a big, broad direction. It's different from a goal in that a goal might be that today I want to engage in a loving way toward my partner. And that will mean today that we go out and we're going to do something together. We're going to have date night. We're going to have our own special time, and I'm going to act in a loving way in that circumstance. That might be a goal, but the loving thing extends beyond that moment to a whole series of moments, a whole series of actions that extend into the future. Um, and if, say, being loving is a value of mine, then it also extends across people and situations. So not just with my partner, but also, well, how do I act in a loving way towards my workmates? How do I act in a loving way toward people I see down at the day centre? How do I act in a loving way toward my friends? Now, the behaviors might be quite different, you know, and yet the through line may be the value of acting in a loving way, you know, and acting in a loving way, also, of course, extends to behaviors that will involve maybe a degree of vulnerability and maybe even a degree of distress. So you can think of acting in a loving way by perhaps having that, fierce, tender, difficult conversation with someone uh, about their behaviour and what you would like them to do differently. So acting in a loving way could be being assertive, for example. So what we're trying to do with the values piece is have people connect with big, broad directions. For them, they might set goals, but the achieving of those goals is only a sort of subset of part of going somewhere in your life. And the advantage of the values work we think in ACT is that it brings meaning and purpose into this moment here and now. You know, so this moment here and now is a moment where I might be able to act in a loving way, for example. How might I act like that? And it connects with a larger purpose, with, in essence, to speak metaphorically, the horizon, with ideas of how do I want to carry myself? What really matters to me fundamentally? So that's the idea of the values work, is it empowers sort of the behavioral work that you might do in therapy by not by going beyond goals to personally chosen directions. And that's what's exciting about it. That's also what's tricky about it, because in my experience, in engaging folk with serious uh, mental health problems, is that many of those folk uh, are disconnected from their values, either because they've been struggling so much with their experiences, or developmentally. Perhaps their first psychotic episode occurred at a time in life where they were still trying to work out who they were and where they fit in and what mattered. And this really disrupted that. And of course, some of the folk that we help have trauma histories and dissociative experiences. So even knowing who I am and what matters to me can be a really tricky process. Um, and the ACT model allows for ways to strengthen these abilities so that you do find things that that matter to you. And of course, what matters to you is the important thing, not what matters to Eric, who's helping you. My job is to help you to discover or construct these directions. So that's a long way of saying Vera, but hopefully, yes, as you said, you get it. And but it's a really important part of this approach is in the end we're judging uh, uh, the whether therapy is being useful by whether it's helping you to do the things that matter to you. I think in general we can say from these active psychosis studies, and it's the early days for researching this. There's still plenty of work to be done to discover, um, you know, when might ACT be useful for people. What particular problems people with psychosis might have. How good is ACT compared to other approaches, say for fostering personal recovery? What we know so far is it's a hopeful situation. It seems like ACT approaches do help to reduce the impact of psychotic symptoms, particularly in terms of believability, so that fusion piece of really getting caught up with those experiences, their emotional impact, and the disruption to people's functioning. Also, sort of beyond the psychotic symptoms piece is well-being. That these studies suggest that ACT is an approach that's sort of like a behavioral activation, exposure-based approach that does help people to, yes, be less distressed, but also have a sense of personal meaning and purpose, um, and a sense of forward motion in their lives, feeling optimistic and having a sense of self that I like, that I value, etc. And as I said, there's been some indications that ACT can reduce readmissions to hospital. There have been a couple of systematic reviews about mindfulness-based approaches for psychosis that suggest that across studies of mindfulness-based approaches to psychosis, that there is something here, particularly about improving people's well-being and quality of life. That the data, it looks hopeful that these sorts of approaches perhaps can sit alongside other cognitive behavioral approaches in being useful to folk in improving their well-being. And so far, what we found is that active psychosis seems acceptable to people. People also are able to respond in a psychologically flexible way to their unusual experiences. So when we do randomized controlled trials, what's been exciting, particularly for me, has been, yes, okay, we see improvements in well-being, say quality of life and recovery orientation as outcomes. What we are also seeing is that changes in this skill of psychological flexibility seem related to these outcomes. So as an evidence-based practitioner and as a researcher, seeing that the hypothesized process is actually linked, changes in that is linked to outcome, really is exciting. Because maybe we can work on better ways of strengthening that process, because it does seem to lead to improvements in well-being. So a little bit about our group approach then. As I said earlier, we developed this approach around Brixton and Stockwell in South London, in the borough of Lambeth, which is a very diverse borough, both in terms of people's wealth, culturally. There's something like 130 languages spoken in Lambeth in South London. And the psychosis services there, a substantial portion of the people who access those services were from black and minority ethnic backgrounds. And there are indications in the United Kingdom that psychological therapy approaches are not necessarily taken up so much by people from black and minority ethnic backgrounds. For cultural reasons, but there's also some sort of systemic biases that sometimes can occur in services. And we were interested in trying to develop something that might engage all sorts of folk, and really reach those people who wouldn't necessarily engage in individual psychological therapy. In the United Kingdom at that time, with the NICE guidance for schizophrenia, treatment guideline that recommended that 100% of people diagnosed with schizophrenia were offered a psychological therapy, either a cognitive behavioral therapy or family intervention. Um, and so, as workers in the National Health Service, our job was to try and increase people's access and the availability of those psychological therapies. And ACT over there was seen as a cognitive behavioral therapy and perhaps a, a group-based approach could be used alongside these individual approaches to reach those people who wouldn't necessarily engage in individual therapy. We, as I said earlier, in our second study, we looked at co-leading our groups with experts by experience, so peer facilitators, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. And I would say from experience that ACT does seem like a good fit for people from minority backgrounds. And the reason I would say this is because the implicit values in ACT are really about helping people to be as free as they can be, to be the person they want to be. And so the skills that we are working on are about this values piece. And the values piece, of course, may extend to people who are, for example, real individualists and value self-reliance. Say through to people who are much more collectivist in their thinking and think of themselves in relation to other people and have roles in relation to other people. And our job as therapists is really just to help people engage in the lives that they want to engage in a way that fits for them culturally, etc. And that's it was gratifying to sort of see when we were evaluating ACT groups that the proportions of people who would come to our ACT groups who were from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds was similar to the proportions of people that would access services. That we were engaging people from minority backgrounds in this approach, and that they were finding value in it. So that piece of trying to build something that's useful and engage the people in the community that you're working in is to me really important. How it started for us, well, Joe and I and then Louise were working away at running these groups in our early intervention services. And Louise Johns is an excellent researcher and based at King's College at the time. And we submitted for a grant and we were able to run the Act for Life study. And this study looked at the feasibility and acceptability of delivering a group intervention in routine community psychosis services. So this is a 4-week group, so a brief group. We would have, between 5 and 8 people in each group, and really focused on supporting well-being and recovery. And this study showed that after just this brief intervention, that there were small improvements in mood and functioning, and the psychological flexibility processes that were strengthened, such as mindfulness, phase-based action, seem to be, there seem to be changes in those when we would do these groups. The groups were closed, so we would run the groups with 2 facilitators. So we would take participants for a block of a month of doing these groups, so there'd be each week. Sorry, Deb, I'm not sure what the second D/O means.
Co-occurring disorders, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So the way our services were structured was that if you had psychosis, you were in our services. So you may very well have comorbid problems with that, and we certainly did have people with comorbid substance use disorders, anxiety disorders, depression, etc. So our groups are designed to be big and broad in terms of being inclusive in that way, because the skills that we're working on are big, broad skills. And they're focused, we focus the groups on well-being rather than psychosis. It can actually occur in our groups that we don't ever talk about psychosis. Not that we're trying to avoid talking about it, it's just that we are focusing on valuing and recovery um, uh, uh, as the aims. Everyone in those groups knows that all the participants are people who've experienced psychosis. It just tends to be, in our experience, that people don't start talking about their unusual experiences or their histories of psychosis, maybe until maybe session 3, if they do at all. Um, and so, um, yeah, the group is not necessarily about sort of psychoeducation about psychosis and stuff. It's much more about helping you to flourish and helping you to try out these skills. But I'll sort of sketch out what we do in just a sec with that. Our second study is the Act for Recovery study. And in this study, it was the same research team, but also included Emma O'Donoghue and Suzanne Jolly. And Suzanne Jolly was the lead investigator for this study. And we looked in this study at the same group, but extended to 6 sessions, and engaging 2 sets of folk, both people with established psychosis, so people who are in long-term services, in receipt of services with psychosis, and also carers. And so we ran separate groups for the carers and for people with psychosis, but based on more or less the same protocol. There's only about one metaphor we had differently, and that was a metaphor called the reservoir metaphor about what fills your reservoir as a carer, what drains your reservoir, what practices can we do to support your well-being in that way. And this was a pilot randomized controlled trial where we were looking at clients and caregivers receiving either the group immediately or after a 12-week wait. And our findings there suggest that this sort of 6-week group does improve self-reported overall well-being, and for people with psychosis, their recovery or personal recovery journey. And we're in the process of going through the tender mercies of peer review for that study. And the protocol in that study is the one that forms the book that we've recently published with New Harbinger Press in the United States. And in that book is a detailed description of how you would run those groups for both people with psychosis and for carers. The other thing we did in the Act for Recovery study, as I mentioned earlier, was we involved peer co-facilitators. So either people with lived experience of psychosis for the groups for people with psychosis, or carers who led the groups alongside us. And in our book, we describe ways of being able to train and consult with and supervise and support peer co-facilitators. Our experience is that you don't have to be an ACT expert to lead an ACT group. And of course, there's lots of value in having people who have expertise from experience sharing about their own experience of, say, being mindful or acting on values, etc. In fact, that's probably a lot more compelling than the sharing that the facilitators would do who maybe don't necessarily have those experiences. And so we're excited to sort of see in the future evaluating what can be done to train and support peer facilitators in doing this, but also that, it seems feasible to be able to run ACT groups without, being an ACT expert. And that seems exciting to me in being able to disseminate this approach and encourage people to try out running these groups in all sorts of settings. Um, so I'll tell you a little bit about what the groups involve now. We have a paper out about this, which describes the approach in general and the adaptations that we make with mindfulness and bays and this sort of thing. And that paper is available on my personal website, along with the detailed group protocol for the Act for Life groups. So you can freely check that out and download that and see what you make of it. But our approach is, we've been very keen to sort of get this out there and have people share with us what they think about these sorts of groups. The group protocol itself is we have weekly sessions. They're 2 hours. We have 4 to 8 participants in each group and 2 to 3 facilitators. I would recommend at least 2 facilitators. It's quite a process of attention and concentration to be running these groups. They're skills-focused groups. They're not necessarily sort of open, sort of long conversations about experiences and sharing in that way. They're much more focused on how about we work on developing these skills and do some things outside of session, and let's discover what it's like to try noticing and mindfulness and values-based action. We simplify the way you do ACT so that usually when people do ACT, they may use a number of metaphors. We simplify it to using one central metaphor in this group called the passages on the bus, which I'll describe in a little bit. And we hang everything off this metaphor. In essence, the idea of the passengers on the bus is that you're the driver of your bus of life. And in the course of your life, various passengers have got on the bus: thoughts, feelings, sensations, urges, voices, etc. And those passengers sometimes like to tell you what to do. Sometimes they're trying to give you good advice, and sometimes maybe they're maybe bullying you, etc. And we are trying to help people to, well, be the bus driver, to decide where they want to go, even with their passengers. And we're really trying to validate, we all have passengers on a bus, and there are, for all of us, times when we get caught up with, fighting and struggling with those passengers. Or there are times when our bus, in essence, sort of gets hijacked, like we start steering in directions that for an easier life, to get away from these experiences, maybe to suppress these experiences, but again at personal cost. Because it can sometimes be a bit of a challenge to imagine yourself as the bus driver or grasp this, we introduce these concepts by having a sort of active video. So someone sharing their own experience of struggling with unusual experiences and it costing them in terms of their values. And we use that person's story to engage the group members. So I wanted to show just a little bit of that so you just sort of see it. Ron, this would be the Paul video.
Sure.
Yeah.
Over to that. You ready for me to start it?
Yeah, I'll just say that we show this video in the first group. This video is just available for people to download, but it allows people to focus on a person describing their experiences. So, Ron, we might just show it, just a bit of it, if that's all right.
Okay. All right, here goes.
So I work in marketing,
So
and
I work in marketing,
right when
and
everything that we're talking about here started to
one of
kick
the
off,
things that we're talking about
things were
here
stressful
started
at
to kick
work
off.
because they were in
Things were
a point
stressful
where
at
they were
work
starting to
because
make
they were at a
redundancies,
point where they
and
were
also the
starting to make
workload was going way
redundancies,
up.
and also the
And looking
workload was
back, I
going way
wasn't
up.
aware of
And looking
how
back, I
stressed
wasn't
out
aware of.
I was getting. I was struggling to concentrate. Things are
I'm pausing for a minute because I'm getting echo and um,
I'm switching off my audio for a sec
yours.
as well.
Okay, should I start it over or just keep going? I'll just
me
keep
twice
going.
as long to do, which is
Just back
frustrating
it
for
up a
me
little bit.
because to kick off, things were stressful at work because they were in a point where they were starting to make redundancies, and also the workload was going way up. And looking back, I wasn't aware of how stressed out I was getting. I was struggling to concentrate. Things are taking me twice as long to do, which is frustrating for me because I've always been really good at my job. Um, so I just kind of pushed on through in the situation, was just trying to work harder. And at one point, my boss called me in and pointed out that she could see that certain things weren't getting done that I should be doing, which is kind of, I was working on a project with a really important client, and so to kind of be brought in and told off like that felt embarrassing. And it was pointed out to me that there was a whole big component of this project that I'm working on that I'd completely forgotten to do, and it just feels humiliating to have that pointed out to me, by my boss. So I'm really struggling at this point, and I didn't feel like I could say anything to anyone, and I'm being put under a lot of pressure from the people above me. And it's after one particular meeting with my manager and his assistant that I took a call at my desk, and I can't remember who the call was from. It's not necessarily relevant, but as I'm taking the call, I could hear a clicking on the line, and it's at that point that I realised that they're actually recording the conversations. They're recording my conversations on my work phone, and that probably realistically they're going to be watching me on CCTV and checking my email communication also. So I asked some other people in the office if they're hearing the clicking on their phones as well, and they all denied it. And a few people who I trust, I would give them my phone when I'm taking a call and ask if they could hear the clicking, and they either couldn't hear it or they denied it. And the way I'm thinking is, if they can't hear it and I can hear it, then they must be watching me and monitoring me as I'm going through my working day. So I don't feel safe in that place anymore. I don't want to work in that building anymore. So I thought, well, I can work from home. And I guess the problem with that is I started taking work home with me. So I'm working all through the day, and I'm also working on weekends and evenings trying to catch up and sort of clear the workload. But nothing seemed to make a difference.
So you get a sense of what Paul's describing with this. I just wanted to show a bit of it, but this video is you can access on the website we have associated with the book. But it's the idea that we have someone describe and make pretty clear what they were feeling and thinking and the choices they were making, so that the group members can. Sorry, is my webcam? So the group members have someone else's story first that they can start applying this sort of metaphor to, and sort of understand, the approach we're taking in that way. Um, and we found that using someone else's story is really helpful. We tend to use a video for it, but you could also tell a story as well. Um, but yeah, that idea of someone else first and their distress, and what Paul describes is having a bunch of unusual experiences and feeling quite suspicious and concerned about his welfare and safety um, in that. Um, and in the group, we asked the group members, well, what does Paul care about? What matters to him? And in the video, Paul describes that it matters to him being a hard worker and contributing and this sort of thing. Um, what passengers are on Paul's bus, and Paul's describing there feeling fearful and humiliated and ashamed, and, worries about his safety and this sort of thing. And so we sort of start introducing the model that the skills that we're taking in that way. So, the group sort of has the same components in it each session. So it has some sort of values work, some sort of mindful and noticing exercises, willingness, which is a sort of common common way we talk about acceptance, active acceptance. So not a resignation about experiences, but in the moment opening to experience if that's useful. Some sort of work on diffusion, which is about observing usually and distancing, and some sort of committed action work. So we do out of session planning. So this is why it's good to have a couple of facilitators, because we break the group into smaller groups. We start identifying varied actions you could take this week. They could be really small actions. They could be large actions. What we're interested in discovering is what it was like to attempt to try those actions, and what did you notice in terms of your passengers, so your experiences that are showing up. What did you notice in terms of what was happening in your life in doing that? So the structure of the group, that there's sort of similar exercises each week, means that if you miss a group session, you'll be familiar again the next time you come, because there's a similar structure. We have different things in each group session, but the structure is familiar. And so this is important with a population of people who can be variable about attendance and have complicated lives. Is come along to this. We're making this predictable. We're making this simple enough that even if you've got lots of intrusions and stuff going on a particular day, you might be able to sort of follow where things are at. And if you get lost, it's okay. The structure is there to sort of remind you of what we're doing. So the key messages in the group are about being open. So willingness of making space or being with unwanted, distressing, or entangling experiences. Cindy, that's a good question about the committed actions. So the committed actions are derived from the person. I mean, other people might suggest things, and as facilitators we might suggest things, but in the end it is what the person decides to do. So we have this, the advantage of a group is that people can suggest stuff, but really we're trying to strengthen your ability to identify something and choose to do it. And that committed action piece would come from your values. So the Paul video goes further. Paul talks about leaving work, being at home, being worried about being poisoned, a relationship breakup. There's a number of distressing things in there. The end of the Paul video is about Paul working on his recovery and making decisions about what he wants to do, returning to work, that sort of thing. And so the committed actions there that people tend to identify in the group are about perhaps being kinder to himself, taking the approach to work in a graded way, but also noticing he is contributing. Sometimes in some groups people describe very deliberately, maybe Paul connecting with others that he used to be fearful of, not because he has to, but because perhaps this is what he wants to do as part of his values. And so, the advantage of a group is that people might have all sorts of ideas of what might be values consistent actions that, say, Paul would take. we so that's the open and I guess active bit. The aware bit is about this present moment focus and noticing, getting here now, and just noticing the experiences you have. And so a regular feature of the group is asking people, well, what passengers are showing up? What are you noticing right now? And really reinforcing noticing. Also noticing when you get caught up with experiences. So if you have um, concerning thoughts and this sort of thing, how much you could get caught up in worrying and ruminating about things, and doing the mindful thing and coming back to being here and now. It's not that we're saying that these experiences aren't meaningful and they aren't important at times to attend to. It's much more being able to have the ability to choose what you do with the experiences that's important to us. Um, Sometimes people think of sometimes people can think that the acceptance piece, the willingness piece, is sort of like ignoring your passengers and ignoring your thoughts and feelings. And that's not really what we're going for. It's being with, but you being in charge of what you decide to do with them, right? So an area where this is sometimes important is with some of the voice hearers we work with. They describe that the voices, give them important social information, or the voices are watching out for them, even if the voices are also saying things that are really distressing and derogatory. So my passenger is being helpful. Maybe it's being really loud and scary, but I can also see what it intends. And so that's the ACT approach is, okay, um, find a place to be with your experiences and work out then what you want to do with them, whether what they're saying to you is useful to you, judging it in that way. And that's why, I mean, I think it's pretty consistent with a personal recovery approach. I mean, our groups are so brief that using the acceptance piece is really this being with thing. If you're working with people individually, it might be that then later on, people are also sort of maybe uh, not just being with, but being compassionate toward, being kind toward their experiences as well. And that sometimes happens in group. But the sort of folk that we tend to have come to group tend to be, tend to be engaging in lots of avoidance and suppression, and just even the step of being with is a big change. Um, so uh, yeah, I mean they're the processes that we focus on. We use all sorts of noticing exercises. So the mindfulness that we do is starts on the outside. Uh, we have mindfulness of a piece of fruit, similar to the raisin exercise. Those of you familiar with that, of a sensory experience of a piece of fruit, or mindfulness of sitting in the chair, before we maybe move into bodily sensations or some sort of movement-based mindfulness. All the exercises are brief. You don't have to do them with your eyes closed. They're not about sort of a meditation as much as just noticing. Um, the diffusion piece, yeah, Vera, is we do things like in ACT, there are conventions where we say noticing things like I'm having the thought that. So I notice my voice talking to me. I'm having my voice. I notice I'm having my voice say this. So practicing that sort of describing. Um, yeah, the insight about symptoms thing. No, not necessarily. We've certainly had people come to group who don't agree with the explanation that they've experienced psychosis. Um, because the group is focused on well-being and flourishing, and not necessarily about whether or not you agree with your diagnosis. Um, Group tends to be uh, experienced by those folk as welcoming and open. Um, we might talk about suspicions and paranoia, but we're not necessarily expecting people to take on those labels for their experiences. Um,
I noticed,
yeah,
I was going to say, I noticed that Deb asks, is there a level of severity of psychosis that one should not try this with?
Yeah. So to come to our group, um, I guess you have to be able to handle being with other people for a couple of hours. I mean, we have a break in the middle of our group, and sometimes people like just sitting there and participating is hard because there's a lot going on for them, or sometimes people can be, uh, maybe pretty thought disordered and have trouble following things, or be very preoccupied with their experiences so that they feel like they really have to spend a lot of time talking about it and that sort of thing. Um,
Yeah.
and so, yeah, the challenge can be, you know, can you participate in group? But we certainly have had people who, um, are having ongoing experiences and participating in group. It's much more the degree to which you're able to engage with others and participate. But that engagement also is not necessarily um, talking a lot. I mean, it's just great if you come. That's the way we run the group. So you can sit there and be quiet for the entire group. You're very welcome to be here. Um, you don't have to participate in the exercises. And so we think that our groups are, pretty wide range of functioning can be there for the participants.
Okay. Rachel asked an interesting question. How might you respond if a client states they do not feel capable of distinguishing between their authentic identity and a voice they hear?
Yeah.
That is, they're uncertain if a behavior is connected with their own values or driven by the voice.
Yeah, it's a classic challenge that I've found with at least some voice hearers. Um, and so the ACT approach, I guess, is to strengthen you as the observer, as the noticer of experience, um, and and so in strengthening that observer perspective, along with that might be strengthening uh, us, uh, helping you to notice that you are choosing. The process of second guessing yourself, particularly if you're hearing a voice that says, well, actually, I'm choosing for you, this sort of thing, it's distressing. And at least some of the ways that we've helped people with that is to maybe even embrace that uncertainty as an experience too. So as we're strengthening you as the noticer and you as the driver of your bus, perhaps also, yeah, here's the voice which can create uncertainty, and uncertainty might be part of the process of acting and valuing. It's easy, of course, for me to say this. It's another thing living that and doing that, and but yeah, I mean, it's a hard experience to live with being unsure of who you are. But the valuing piece over time, for those people who sort of respond to it, it does look like much more that is generated from me. And my experiences are mine. And my experiences may also include this voice that's sort of along for the ride. Yeah, that claims to be the driver of the bus. But perhaps I can discover ways where I'm actually the driver of my life. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
It was,
Yeah, it's okay for participants to be silent. A lot of our participants are silent. We're the chatty ones, right? Um, and so people, um, we have found when we followed up people after group that they find group a friendly environment, even if they didn't say anything. They were just sitting there. And a number of people can be just sitting there. There's a classic experience in our groups which we call tumbleweeds, which I'm sure folk in the US understand this one. You ask people for, hey, what are your thoughts about this? And there's these tumbleweeds, just silence. And so what we do is a few things. I mean, we wait for people to say something, but we also share our own experiences too in the group. So we're not doing the group to people, we share the group experience with them. And so we also set our own out of session valued activities. We share our varied activities. We share our noticing through the mindfulness exercises, all that sort of stuff, to model these processes. And we find that over time then people do sort of start sharing. We found, yeah, qualitatively that even the very quiet people find in general find the group supportive and that universal aspect. And we have found in our qualitative follow-ups that people usually find others not judgmental, but actually kind and warm, even if they're quiet.
Yeah, notice Paul asked an interesting question. What if Paul in the video experiences diffusion exercises or noticing as invalidating of the truth of his experience?
Yeah, yeah. And the intention of diffusion is, of course, not to invalidate your experience. And this is one of the things about diffusion is, I guess, without validation, without a good therapeutic relationship or a good group experience, sometimes eager therapists can start doing diffusion, and it will be experienced as invalidating. What we do is, of course, what's valid uh, that we can connect with as humans, even if we disagree about um, uh, your particular take of a situation, is your emotions, is feeling afraid, feeling humiliated, that's a real experience. And that is really what we convey is, yeah, that is hard to live with. How can we help you to find ways of, of responding in ways that are going to work with you with those experiences? And so, yeah, we're careful to check um, that we are not setting up things that look like we're telling you you're wrong. You know, we may agree to disagree, um, but we're interested in your well-being and what matters to you. And if an exercise feels like it's sort of off, that's not what's being intended, and we're interested in your experience of that.
Just do a time check-in, Eric. I don't know if you have to run right at this hour or if you want to talk for a little bit more or how you want to do it.
I'm happy to talk for a little bit if people have more questions. What works for you, Ron? And another.
Oh, I'm fine. I don't have to run.
Yeah.
Somebody asked if the slides will be available. Yeah, I'll send them out. Thanks, Charlie, for posting Dr. Morris's website. Cindy was asking, I don't think we got to this one. What are the ways you guide someone to become aware of their actions if they are not proportionate to what others are seeing and hearing, and if the person's actions have a detrimental consequence, like going to jail for assault?
Yeah, yeah. And so we think that part of increasing that awareness is being here now and finding ways of being here now and noticing. And so, of course, sometimes what happens is when we're very distressed, our attention narrows to what's, say, threatening to us. It also sort of narrows down in us so that we're maybe not necessarily noticing the impact of our behavior upon others. And so the approach broadly is, well, slow down and notice. Let's get curious about when you do things, what is the impact upon your life? If you find yourself getting in trouble, what's going on there, right? I mean, it's probably not what you intended, and yet this is what's happening. And so we're trying to encourage a sort of gentle curiosity and learning from experience, and that, of course, may well be, a valued action might be having awkward conversations with others about how you're coming across, um, whether what you intend is what's experienced. Now, we're trying to strengthen your ability to be able to maybe hear what others say. And sometimes, of course, when we ask people how we came across, we might hear some fairly bruising stuff. Um, And so this is where these skills of being open, being accepting of what might show up for us when we maybe hear things that are distressing can be useful. We're not trying to encourage people to be, doormats and just take everything that people, do to them. I mean, a number of people in our groups, sometimes, they might live in circumstances where there is friction, or, sometimes, exploitation, and we are encouraging them to uh, to be assertive and stand up for themselves if that's the important valued action. Um, but for a lot of others, it's about attending to relationships and finding out whether actually what I'm what I'm doing, how is that working for you, and the capacity to be open to feedback and not have it send you into a tailspin. Um, I think involves, or can involve, active acceptance and a sort of degree of non-reactivity. Um, I mean, you feel it inside, but you may not be doing your habitual ways of responding that don't work for you. So that's you're very much an ACT idea of if you keep doing the things you've already done, you may get what you've already always got. And so we're interested in trying new things. And of course, some of those new things will involve a degree of vulnerability and awkwardness.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. I see a lot of people are thanking you, and I'm noticing.
Yeah.
I think we're at the end of the questions. Charlie made another remark about group rather than individual processes,
Mhm.
as well as collaborative lived experience can make a big difference for people who aren't seeing any option other than objectively extreme.
Yeah. Well, this is the advantage of being in a group, isn't it? Is that you learn from other people's experience. Um, so we you see other people start to use these skills, or you have the advantage of maybe five other people's life stories that both cohere with yours and are different from yours. But the common humanity piece that many times happens in groups happens in these groups too. And so I can see that I am like you in many ways. I can see that what I struggle with you may also struggle with too. And as I said earlier in this talk, that sense of alienation, of disconnection from others, I think that's a big deal for people with psychosis, at least people I've seen. And so having a place to come and participate with others who get it and who, in many ways are just like you, and you know also maybe discovering that the people helping you are like you in many ways. I mean, one of the things that a few of our participants have said is because we self-disclose a bit in ACT about our own passengers and this sort of thing as facilitators, some of our participants have said to us, I didn't know that mental health professionals were so messed up. It's like,
Great.
that's excellent, good. Perhaps, like, boy, you guys are messed up too, and that that leveling seems important. I'm not above you. I mean, I'm responsible for making sure that the group is a safe enough place for us to do some interesting things together. But I am not different from you in some fundamental way. I mean, you might have more than your fair share of tough experiences uh, to deal with, and I'm not suggesting in any way that, in an invalidating way, that it's just the same in that way. And I know I'm lucky and I'm privileged and etc. But in some fundamental ways, we are the same. We all can struggle and suffer and not do very clever things. And
Yeah.
and our group participants, yeah, a number of them have remarked that discovering that has been, um, maybe it's the first time in many years that they felt equal uh, to the people helping them. Which I mean, it saddens me to hear that because I think that, of course, effectively helping people is being respectful, um, is noticing that equality. But our groups have that flavor. Yeah.
Such an important point. Thank you. All right. Well,
I'm so appreciative of all these thank yous. It's, hey, the future is good, Ron. That's very
yeah.
lovely of you guys to share that. And yeah, I mean, as Ron said, the slides are available. Our website associated with the book is in the slides there. Yeah, actforpsychosis.com. Whole bunch of free resources on there for you to check out about this. And if you're trying out this approach wherever you are, I mean, feel free to get in touch with us. We'd love to hear about your experiences. Um, we're really keen to support people doing this work and learning from other people about this work. I mean, this protocol has been used in a bunch of different countries. So in the United Kingdom and in Italy and Spain and Belgium, as well as in Australia. And I know people have been doing sort of variations of this in the States. But it's early days, and we want to learn from other people's experiences about doing this, about how to reach and be useful and helpful to people recovering from psychosis. So it really is, an approach of getting this work out there and sharing and discovering together.